He rolls up his sleeves, takes off his jacket, folds it over the back of a chair, says nothing. 90 seconds later, a man is dead on the lab floor, and Gus Fring's pulse hasn't changed. What does it cost to become someone who never lets anyone see them bleed? Gustavo Fring ran a fried chicken chain, funded university scholarships, sat on a hospital board, and shook the hand of the DEA's assistant special agent in charge at a community fundraiser. He also ran the largest methamphetamine operation in the American Southwest for the better part of a decade. And by the time anyone in his world figures that out, it's already too late to matter. 2 men. Or maybe it was never 2 men at all. Maybe it was one perfectly engineered performance, running so long and so precisely that even the character himself may have stopped being able to tell the difference. That's the question this video is built around. What does it cost to become someone who never lets anyone see them bleed? Look at the 2 endpoints of his arc. Early Gus, the version we only meet in flashback, is a young immigrant in Chile and later Mexico in the late 1980s. Standing in a warehouse, watching the person he loves most in the world get executed a few feet away from him. He does nothing, not because he's weak, because he's already absorbing the lesson that will define the rest of his life. Now look at the other end. 20-some years later, a man in his 50s, half his skull gone in an explosion, already dead on his feet, and his hands go, calmly and methodically, to straighten his tie before he finally falls. Same man, same discipline, 2 decades apart, and the wound never once got permission to reach the surface. And that's really what makes Gus different from most great antagonists in this genre. The usual story is a slow transformation, a good man corrupted. An ordinary man revealed to have been hiding something monstrous all along. A mask that cracks a little further with every episode. Gus doesn't crack. He doesn't transform either. Not in the way we usually mean it. He was already finished transforming by the time the story picks him up. What we're actually watching, across 2 entire shows, is less a change than a maintenance schedule, the daily hourly work of keeping a finished structure from ever showing a single crack. So how does someone travel that distance? Not through one decision. Through a ladder, 6 rungs, each one asking him to trade away a little more of himself in exchange for a little more control. Climb high enough on that ladder, and you stop being a person who has feelings and start being a person who manages the appearance of not having any. The rest of this video is about what that trade actually costs. He's warm but unreachable, generous but ruthless, endlessly patient but capable of instant surgical violence the moment patience finishes doing its job. Beloved by an entire community that has no idea what it's actually applauding. Every one of those contradictions sounds like a character flaw when you list them like that. Watched closely, in order, across 2 shows and roughly 2 decades of story time, they stop looking like flaws and start looking like a system, a deliberate, load-bearing structure built 1 rung at a time, by a man who decided very early that feeling things in public was a luxury he could no longer afford. Call it the silence ladder. 6 disciplines Gus builds, one on top of the other, that together explain both how he wins and what winning takes from him. Rung 1, say nothing about the wound. Grief becomes leverage the second someone else sees it, so you stop letting anyone see it. Rung 2, own the room before you own the business. Build a reputation so spotless that nobody thinks to look underneath it. Rung 3, never react, only calculate. Trade the satisfaction of retaliating today for the certainty of destroying someone completely, on your own schedule. Rung 4, separate the man from the method. Wall the violence off so completely that it never has to answer to the identity doing the talking. Rung 5, let violence speak so you don't have to. When the mask finally does come off, make sure the stillness is more frightening than any amount of shouting could ever be. Rung 6, own everything, even your own death. The discipline holds until, quite literally, nothing else does. Each rung sits on top of the last one. Skip a rung and the whole structure collapses. The restaurant chain, the empire, the 20-year wait for revenge, all of it. So let's climb it, 1 step at a time, and see exactly what each step costs him. One more thing before we start climbing. Somewhere in these 6 rungs is a crack, a rule Gus follows so perfectly, for so long, that it starts to look unbreakable. It isn't. There's exactly 1 moment in over 20 years where he breaks his own system. On purpose. For a reason that has nothing to do with strategy, and that one break is the actual reason this story ends the way it does. Keep it in the back of your mind as we go. By the time we reach the top of the ladder, you'll know precisely which rung it was and precisely what it cost him to break it. Rung 1. Say nothing about the wound. Every version of Gus Fring that audiences meet across Breaking Bad is already finished, polished, unreadable, decades into a performance so complete it looks like a personality. To understand where Rung 1 actually gets built, you have to go back further, to Better Call Saul, to a warehouse in the late 1980s where a much younger Gus watches Hector Salamanca execute his partner, Max Arcanega, over a botched deal. Here's the scene. Plainly, Hector forces Gus to watch. He wants a reaction. He wants Gus to beg, to break, to hand him something to enjoy. And Gus, in his 20s, in love, watching the person he built his entire imagined future with die a few feet away, gives him nothing, not a flinch, not a sound, not even the decency of looking away. The script direction for this moment is almost nothing at all, a line or two noting that Gus watches. That's the entire instruction on the page. What Giancarlo Esposito does with his face in that scene is where the character actually gets born, in real time, in front of the camera. No tears, no trembling jaw, just a stillness that stops looking like composure and starts looking like something inside him quietly, permanently sealing shut. Watch it back, and the only part of him still moving is his eyes, and even those go flat well before the scene ends. So what does young Gus take from that warehouse? Something simple and something brutal at the same time. Grief shown is grief weaponized. Hector wanted a reaction because a reaction is information. It tells an enemy what you love, what you'll pay any price to protect, exactly where to press next time they want something from you. Standing in that warehouse, Gus makes a decision that will outlast every other decision in his life. He will never again hand another human being that kind of information. Not out of coldness, out of survival. That's rung 1, and once he climbs it, he never comes back down. Every scene of the nice Gus, the philanthropist, the mild-mannered restaurant owner, the man who remembers his employees' names, is downstream of a warehouse he never talks about. Ask yourself what it would take to watch the worst thing that's ever happened to you happen, and decide, in that exact moment, that you would never let your face say so again. That's not composure. That's a wound performing surgery on itself. Notice, too, what the show refuses to give us in that scene. No flashback score swelling underneath it, no slow motion, none of the usual grammar that tells an audience, grieve now. The camera stays as flat and unhurried as Gus's own face, because the show is teaching the audience the same lesson. It's teaching him. Feel too much here, on the page or in the room, and someone will use it against you. Rung 1 isn't just a trait Gus adopts. It's a rule the whole story quietly agrees to follow every time it approaches this character. And once you see that rule, you start seeing it everywhere in the earlier show, retroactively. Every time Breaking Bad's Gus declines to raise his voice, every time he lets an insult or a threat slide off him without comment, you're not watching a naturally calm man. You're watching the aftershock of a warehouse the show won't let you see for another 5 years. That's the trick of watching these two series in either order. The trauma either explains everything that comes after it, or it recontextualizes everything you thought you already understood. Either way, Rung 1 is the foundation the other 5 are poured on top of. Rung 2, own the room before you own the business. If Rung 1 is defensive, don't let anyone see the wound. Rung 2 is where Gus goes on offense. Before he builds an empire, he spends years building a face for the empire to hide behind, and he builds it with the same obsessive precision he'll later bring to a meth lab. Los Pollos Hermanos isn't a front in the lazy, cardboard cutout sense so many crime dramas settle for. Gus is genuinely, meticulously good at running a fast food chain. He personally checks walk-in freezer temperatures. He hands out community scholarship checks for local news cameras, in one of the show's most quietly unsettling scenes. He stands behind the counter making small talk with DEA agent Hank Schrader, nothing more than a business owner chatting pleasantly with a regular customer about the menu. The script gives him ordinary lines, a joke about the chili powder, a have a nice day. Nothing that reads as remarkable on the page. But watch what Esposito does with the pacing. He never once rushes a single word, and it's the exact same unhurried cadence he uses when closing an actual cartel deal a few episodes later. That's not an accident of acting style. That's the entire point. The performance is deliberately, precisely identical whether he's discussing chicken or laundering blood money, because to Gus there is no meaningful difference in register between the two conversations. Both are the same skill, performed at the same register, to the same audience of people who are never allowed to know which one they're watching. That's rung 2. Own the room before you own the business. A criminal empire obviously needs infrastructure, a lab, a distribution network, capital. But Gus understood something most television villains never bother to learn. The infrastructure that actually protects you for over a decade isn't the lab. It's the fact that when investigators eventually come looking for a monster, what they find instead is a philanthropist with immaculate freezer temperatures and a spotless service record, standing right in front of them, refilling their coffee. Here's a smaller moment that gets skipped in almost every breakdown of this character, but it teaches rung 2 better than the famous scenes do. In Better Call Saul, Gus personally walks a restaurant floor and fires an employee on the spot for a minor food safety violation. No anger, no lecture, just a quiet, immediate decision. Delivered with the same courteous tone he uses for everything else. There's no cartel money on the line here, no revenge plot, just a man enforcing exactly the same standard of control over a napkin dispenser that he'll later enforce over a multinational drug empire. That's the tell. Rung 2 isn't a strategy he switches on for high-stakes moments. It's the operating setting his entire personality runs on. All the time. Whether anyone's watching or not. It's the same thing he tells Walter White later on. Almost as an aside, I hide in plain sight, same as you. He's not being clever when he says it, he's being completely literal. There's no off version of Gus to catch slipping, because hiding in plain sight was never a technique he switched on for high-stakes moments. It's just what he is. And it's worth noticing how far Gus takes this. He doesn't just avoid law enforcement, he actively courts them. He funds a DEA scholarship. He lets Hank walk through his restaurant unaccompanied. Most people hiding something instinctively create distance from the thing that could expose them. Gus does the opposite, and it isn't recklessness. It's the most sophisticated version of rung 2 imaginable. Proximity to suspicion, handled with enough composure, reads as innocence. Distance reads as guilt. He understood that the safest place to stand was directly in the blind spot of the people looking for him. Compare that to how most fictional crime bosses handle exposure. A wall of lawyers, a fortress compound, a small army keeping outsiders at arm's length. Gus builds no walls at all, at least none anyone can see. He builds a welcome mat instead, and it works better than any fortress ever could. Because a fortress announces that there's something worth guarding. A chicken restaurant with a smiling owner announces nothing. So which is actually more secure? The guarded compound everyone assumes is hiding something, or the open door nobody thinks to walk through twice? Rung 3, never react, only calculate. Here's the other line Gus is famous for. You will never ever ask me about that again. He says this to Walter White, quietly, almost gently, after Walt oversteps by asking about Gus's history with the Salamancas. One sentence, no raised voice, and it lands as more frightening than anything Walt does with his voice across 5 entire seasons. Here's what most people miss on a first watch of that scene. Gus isn't reacting to Walt's question, he's declining to react to it. Those are opposite psychological events, and the gap between them is the whole engine of rung 3. Underneath that flat, quiet delivery is a revenge plot that stretches back more than 20 years, through the warehouse in Mexico, through the decades spent laundering money through fried chicken, through an empire built specifically so that one day it could be used to destroy the men who killed Max. All of that is running behind Gus's eyes the entire time Walt is talking. None of it shows. What does the script actually say here? A handful of flat lines, the kind of dialogue that a dozen different actors could deliver a dozen different ways, from a shout to a sneer. What Esposito adds is the gap, the pause before he answers, the refusal to match Walt's rising panic with anything at all. Most actors playing a threat lean into volume, because volume is the easy signal for danger. Esposito leans the opposite direction, into stillness, and it works precisely because by this point in the show, the audience already knows exactly what Gus is capable of when he finally does act, so the silence itself becomes the threat, doing more work than a raised voice ever could. This is rung 3, and it's the rung that separates Gus from every hot-tempered antagonist in the genre before him. Never react, only calculate. Trade the satisfaction of retaliating right now for the certainty of destroying someone completely, later, entirely on your own schedule. He sits on a specific personal act of revenge for over 2 decades before it finally pays off. So ask yourself honestly, could you do that? Could you carry 20 years of grief in complete silence and never once let it slip in front of the person who caused it? It's worth pausing on just how rare that patience is, even in a genre that loves a slow-burn revenge plot. Michael Corleone waits years to move against the men who wronged his family, and even he can't help but let the audience see the cost on his face by the end of it. The famous final shot of him alone, aged, hollowed out by what the waiting did to him. Gus never gives us that shot. Whatever the 20-year wait costs him internally, he refuses to let it register even once the debt is finally collected. That's not the absence of a wound. That's a wound with better discipline than almost anyone else in the genre has ever managed to write. Do the math on that timeline for a second, because it's easy to let decades slide past as a figure of speech. The Warehouse happens in the late 1980s. The reckoning with Hector doesn't arrive until deep into Breaking Bad, well over 20 years later. That's not a man holding a grudge through one bad year, or even 5. That's most of an entire adult life spent laundering money, building a legitimate business empire, cultivating relationships with the DEA, and manufacturing methamphetamine, all of it. On some level, in service of a single delayed act of retribution he never once mentions out loud until the moment it's finally executed. Remember the crack we mentioned back at the start of this list? This is the rung where the pressure behind it actually starts building. 20 years of swallowing this particular want doesn't just test patience, it stores something up. Keep that in mind. We're getting closer to the moment it finally gives. Rung 4. Separate the man from the method. Rung 4 is the one that makes Gus structurally different from every meth kingpin who came before him in this genre. He doesn't just hide the business from the world, he walls it off from himself. The clearest illustration is the Super Lab, a state-of-the-art meth facility built underneath a fully licensed industrial laundry service. Watch the scene where Gus first shows the space to Walt and Jesse. He discusses ventilation systems, drainage, tile specifications, with the exact measured enthusiasm of an architect showing off a passion project, which, in a real sense, is precisely what this is to him. The script's stage directions here read almost clinically. Gus gestures to the equipment, explains the layout, functional, unemotional writing, giving an actor very little to grab onto emotionally. Esposito plays it exactly that flat, and that restraint is the genius of the scene. He doesn't perform villainy while giving the tour. He performs pride, craftsmanship, the same register a chef might use unveiling a brand new kitchen. There's no tonal shift whatsoever between "this is where we will produce the purest methamphetamine in America" and "this is where we handle industrial laundry contracts for half the city." To Gus, both sentences come from the same part of his mind, the part obsessed with precision, rather than the part that has to live with what the precision ultimately produces. That's Rung 4. Separate the man from the method. For Gus, compartmentalization isn't only operational security, isn't only hiding a lab underneath a legitimate business to keep it off the DEA's radar. It's psychological survival. If the businessman who funds scholarships and the man who orders murders are kept in two completely sealed rooms inside the same head, neither one ever has to answer to the other. It's the exact same trick Rung 1 taught him with grief, just scaled up to run an entire empire. Whatever you refuse to let touch the surface can't be used against you, and that includes your own conscience. The same wall shows up in how Gus manages people, not just spaces. He relies on Mike Ehrmantraut for exactly the kind of hands-on brutality he'd rather not personally perform. And the relationship works because Mike operates under an almost identical code of professional silence. Gus doesn't surround himself with loyalists who love him. He surrounds himself with people who understand the same rule he lives by, that the job and the person doing the job are two separate things, and you never let one leak into the other. It's a wall he builds around himself, and then, methodically, recruits an entire organization to help him maintain. Even his relationship with Walt and Jesse runs on this logic. He never pretends to like them, and he never bothers pretending to hate them either. Both would be a kind of leakage, an admission that the personal has crept into the professional. He assesses their usefulness, manages them accordingly, and discards the arrangement the moment the calculation changes. Not cruelty for its own sake, just the method, kept scrupulously separate from the man, doing exactly what it was built to do. Hold on to this rung specifically. Of everything Gus builds over 6 rungs, this is the one rule that ends up deciding how he dies. Rung 5. Let violence speak so you don't have to. Every rung so far has been built entirely on restraint. Rung 5 is the one moment that restraint visibly breaks, and it's still, somehow, the most controlled act of violence anywhere in the show. The scene, Gus inside the super lab in a full hazmat suit, calmly and methodically executing his own lieutenant, Victor, with a box cutter directly in front of Walt and Jesse, purely as a message. There's no shouting, no visible rage. He removes his jacket first, rolls up his sleeves with total precision. The killing itself takes seconds. The ritual surrounding it takes considerably longer, and that imbalance is entirely deliberate. This is the scene the cold open dropped you into. Now you know the rest of it, not the how, but the why. Here's the script versus performance gap that turns this scene into one of the most quoted moments in the entire series instead of just a shocking beat. The writing gives Gus almost no dialogue across the whole sequence. The message gets delivered without a single line explaining why he's doing it. What the direction and performance do instead is turn the preparation itself into the terror. The suit, the gloves, the unhurried, precise unrolling of the sleeves. By the time the box cutter finally appears on screen, the audience has already imagined the violence 3 separate times in their heads, each version worse than what actually gets shown. This is Rung 5. Let violence speak so you don't have to. Notice the contrast with nearly every other antagonist in prestige television. The ones who lose control in a burst of screaming rage, the ones whose violence reads as an eruption. Gus does the opposite, and it's the whole reason the scene still gets clipped and discussed years later. He proves that total composure is more terrifying than any amount of shouting could ever be, because rage tells an audience that a person has lost control of themselves. This tells them the exact opposite, that the murder is exactly as controlled, exactly as rehearsed, exactly as unremarkable to him as the small talk about chicken 2 beats ago. Rage is human. What Gus does in that lab is something else entirely. Watch Walt and Jesse's faces during this scene, and you get the real payoff of everything the previous 4 rungs built. They aren't just afraid of the box cutter. They're afraid of what it means that a man capable of this has spent months being unfailingly polite to them, that everything they thought they understood about who they were dealing with was, in fact, a carefully maintained surface over something they never saw coming. That's what Rung 5 actually delivers. Not just a body, but a complete, permanent recalibration of how dangerous everyone in the room now understands Gus to be. Rung 6. Own everything. Even your own death. And then there's the ending. The moment the entire silence ladder either gets validated or exposed as a system that finally fails at the one moment it mattered most. Go back to Rung 4 for a second, because this is where the setup for the ending actually gets planted. Look how much. Gus doesn't do his own dirty work. That's the entire point of Victor, of an organization built specifically so that Gus never has to be personally present for the risky, exposed, emotional parts of the business. 20 years of discipline, and exactly one rule holds the whole structure together. Never be in the room yourself when the stakes are personal. Then he breaks it. Gus finally corners Hector Salamanca, the man who killed Max, the debt he's been carrying quietly since Rung 1, and he does it himself, in person. No mic outside the door, no proxy delivering the message, no professional distance of any kind. After 2 decades of never once letting the personal touch the professional, the one thing he cannot delegate is the satisfaction of watching Hector's face when he finally says it out loud. He delivers a monologue Hector can't even answer, since Hector is nonverbal by this point in the story, communicating only through a bell on his wheelchair. Gus gets the moment he's spent 2 decades waiting for. He says the thing he's needed to say. And then Hector, in the last act available to him, rings the bell that detonates a bomb hidden inside the wheelchair. The explosion is instant. What follows is not. Gus walks slowly out of the blast radius, and for one unbearable, extended shot, the camera holds on the side of his face that looks completely untouched, before very slowly revealing that the other half of his skull is simply gone. And here's the detail people are still talking about, years after it aired, before he finally collapses. His hands go to his tie and straighten it. One last adjustment, then he falls. The scripted direction for this beat is reportedly simple. Gus is caught in the blast. The damage is revealed. He dies. The tie, the single most quoted image from the entire death sequence, functions as a performance and directing choice layered on top of that page direction, not something the dialogue itself demands. And it is the whole character compressed into one gesture, even with half his skull gone. even in the literal last seconds of his life. The discipline does not break. He doesn't scream. He doesn't reach for anyone. He fixes his tie because appearing in total control is the one thing he has never, not once across an entire adult life, allowed himself to stop doing, and he isn't about to start now, with 3 seconds left. That's rung 6. Own everything, even your own death. But look at what actually got him there. Hector doesn't win because he's clever. He wins because the one time in 20 years that Gus's system had a hole in it, Gus climbed through the hole himself, willingly. For a payoff no bodyguard could deliver on his behalf. Every other rung of this ladder is about outsourcing risk, the violence, the exposure, the confrontation, to someone or something else. Rung 6 is the one time Gus refuses to outsource anything, and it's also the only rung that gets him killed. The discipline didn't protect him at the end. The one crack in the discipline is what finished him. And notice what this scene rhymes with: a warehouse. Decades earlier, where a younger Gus stood and watched the person he loved die without letting his face move. A nursing home, decades later, where an older Gus dies without letting his face move either, except this time, he's the one who walked into the room. Nobody forced this confrontation. He could have sent Mike. He could have waited another 6 months, planned it from a safer distance, kept the 20-year record intact. He chose not to. After his hands go to his tie and straighten it, one last adjustment, before he finally falls. That's not just the discipline holding until the end. That's the discipline being the last thing he has left to hold on to, precisely because the want underneath it finally won. Ending so, what does it cost to become someone who never lets anyone see them bleed? Gus Fring paid for it with almost everything a person has to spend. The one relationship that made him who he was, any friendship that came after it, every ordinary human reaction a normal life quietly requires, and eventually his own face. In exchange, he got roughly 20 years of running an empire nobody saw coming. Not the DEA, not the cartel, not even Walter White, until it was almost too late to matter. But here's the part. Most breakdowns of this character get backwards. The common read is that Gus dies exactly as disciplined as he lived, the composed man, composed to the last second, tie straightened even in death. Look at the actual sequence of events again, though, and it wasn't the discipline that let Hector's plan work. It was the one moment the discipline went missing. Gus spent 2 decades building a system whose entire purpose was making sure he never had to be personally, physically present for the dangerous, emotional moments. And then, the one time it mattered most, he walked into the room himself anyway. So which is the truer version of Gus Fring, the machine that ran flawlessly for 20 years, or the man who, the second revenge was finally close enough to touch, broke the one rule that machine was built on? He'd probably tell you the discipline never failed, that walking in himself was simply the plan all along. Maybe it was. Or maybe that's just the last lie the mask ever told, even to the one person it was built to protect. If you made it this far, you already have an opinion. Say it in the comments. Did Gus Fring's control kill him, or did it die with him? And is there a real difference between the two?